Alright, hello to another Pre-Calc 12 class. We are in section 0.4. This one's all about asking good questions. So what is this lesson about? That would be a great question to ask. Let's look at the purposes. So in this class, or this video, you are going to learn how to make good questions and also how to recognize the difference between a good question and a bad question, so that when you have a question, you'd be able to think about it and say, is this a good one or is this a bad one? So what makes a good question? There's a few things we can look at. So first of all, it has to be a question. Okay, it can't just be a statement. You've probably heard this many times of me being in class and I say, okay, do any of you have any questions? And then someone will raise their hand and say, Mister, I don't get it. That's not a question. I need a question. When you're making your column in your notes that's on questions, they have to be questions. So that's the first thing that makes a good question, is a question. Try to be as specific as possible. So look at a specific point that you don't get and tell me about that, or ask a question on that. So if you're just saying, can you explain the whole set of notes? That's not very specific. But if you're saying, can you explain this example here at this step? Because I don't understand that. This is a good question. It's very specific. And it also has to be relevant. No crazy questions that have nothing to do with the topic. It has to be relevant. So these are some things that make up a good question. Now, good questions also have a few other characteristics. So good questions take some time. So you won't be able to necessarily make a good question right off the top of your head. Sometimes you might, if it's something that's fairly obvious, but sometimes it'll take a little bit more time to formulate. And that's because they require thinking. It's easy to put up a hand and say, I don't get it. That takes no thinking. But if it takes a little bit of thought to say, okay, I understand the first few steps, but this second step I don't get. Could you please explain this step? That shows me you're actually thinking about it, as opposed to just saying, I don't get anything. Put a little thought into it. And this actually requires some practice. So it's not going to necessarily come naturally. It'll take a little bit of work to think of some good questions. So that's what we're going to be doing today, looking at some of this. Example 1. So suppose you're given this statement. So this is the last sentence I will be writing, and I'm going to stop mid-sent. So let's see if we can distinguish in these following questions which would be a good question and which is not. What is a cent? Well, is this a good question? I would think so. So this might be, you're a bit confused by what this is. You might not get the joke right away. So if someone asks, what is a cent? I would say this is a good question. It's specific. It's talking about this last word in the sentence. It's a term that maybe you don't know. So this would be a good question. Next one is, if this is going to be your last sentence, then why is there another sentence written after it? This is a very good question. So if you ask this one, this is a great question. It's very specific. It shows that you've put some thought into it, and it's expanding on what is written. It's not just what is this part of it. It's showing that you're thinking beyond and you're understanding this question. This is a good one. I don't get it. Please don't put this in the question part. I might take your notes and rip it up. Don't ask. This isn't a question. This is a statement. Who wrote this? Okay, this one might not be relevant depending on what we're talking about, but this is actually still a good question. It's a question that's going beyond and trying to understand this statement. Now, I don't know who wrote it, so I wouldn't be able to answer it, but this is still a good question. It's specific, talking about the origin of this statement to try and understand it a bit better. So in this we've got, what is a cent? That's good. If this is your last sentence, then why is there another sentence written after it? Also good. I don't get it. Don't do it. Just don't. Who wrote this? Another good question. Let's take a look at another example. You always need to multiply before you add. Let's take a look at some questions and see which of these are good. How do you multiply? So this all depends on your grade level if this is a good question. If I have you in my Pre-Calc 12 class asking me how to multiply, that's a bad question. You should know how to do this by now. If you're in a younger grade, yes, maybe this would be a great question, but this is something that you should be able to do, or at least you could write this down if maybe you forgot how to long multiply. So it is possible for this to be a good question. However, you should know how to do this. So it's not a bad one. It's just you should know it. Are there any exceptions to this rule? So this is a great question. It's again expanding on what is here. It shows that you understand what it's saying and you want to know something beyond that. Of course, there are some exceptions. If you add some brackets, you're definitely going to add before you multiply. So this is a great one. Are butterflies really made from caterpillars? Not relevant. Good question, but not in this case. So that is a biology question. We are not in biology. Or maybe physics if we talk about some energy. But this, no. Is this coming on the test? All right, so this is a good question. However, it's just don't ask it. Everything's going to be on a test. And if there's something that I wasn't going to put on the test and you ask it, I will put it on the test. So good question, yes. Don't ask it though. I don't want it. All right, so in class, what are we going to do? So we're going to look at some more examples, and we're going to try and come up with some questions, some good ones, and distinguish between some good and bad ones. And I'm going to do a short little lesson from Pre-Calc 11. You can think of this as a review. And from this, you'll be able to try and come up with some good questions, and you're going to practice the notes, taking some notes. So this one, you're specifically going to look at questions. So I think this is the end, right? Yep. So that's asking questions. We're going to go through this in class. This is a skill that is really good and really handy for you to have. Again, not just in Pre-Calc 12. This is great for all your other classes. So this is a skill that is just handy. It's good to know. That's why I want to spend an entire class just on asking questions. So let's get into this in class.